We'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome, everyone. As I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or even good night, possibly wherever you're logging from, or if you're watching this as a recording at a later time. Welcome. Today, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about European climate regulations. Before I jump into that, just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is recorded, so if you want to share this recording with somebody else in your organization that was not able to join, you will be getting a recording of it probably within a day or two, and you will be able to share this information with anybody else in the organization that you think it will benefit from this information. During the webinar, feel free to please jot down your questions in the Q&A section of the platform here, and we will do our best to answer any questions that are asked. If we run out of time and we are not able to answer all the questions, we'll make sure that somebody from our team will reach out to you and get those questions answered. I'm really excited because we had a very large number of attendees that wanted to listen in on this webinar, more than 800. And I'm still seeing the number rise and number of attendees going up. So as you log in, welcome, and we'll get the ball rolling here. So first, as a matter of introduction, I'm Lalit Agarwal, Vice President of Energy Management and Sustainability for EnergyCAP. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Jessica. Jessica, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for having me here with you today. But I'm Jessica Pransky. I'm a principal analyst at Verdantix. And for those of you who are not familiar with Verdantix, we are an independent research and advisory company headquartered in London with offices also in Boston, which is where I'm based, as well as New York. The company completely focuses on sustainability. So I sit within our ESG and sustainability team, leading research on sustainability related software, ESG risks, and a whole variety of other topics. But we also cover items such as environmental health and safety, climate risk management more generally, smart buildings, and operational excellence. So very nice to be here with you today.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll quickly look at the agenda for the next 45 minutes or so. So we are going to first look at the regulatory sustainability landscape globally. So not just Europe, but what does it look like globally? And then we'll do a little bit of deeper dive into the CSRD, which is the more recent corporate sustainability reporting directive that Europe has adopted. What are the components of it? What are the impacts that are coming from it? And then Jessica is going to do some deep dive into some of the findings that Verdantix and the team have identified in terms of where the market stands today and how ready it is to be able to comply with the CSRD directive. And then I'm going to take a little bit of time towards the end and share with you how you can probably make sure that all the data that you have is collated, allocated, reported, and audited, and so you can report with confidence to your regulatory requirement. And then we'll open it up with some question and answers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica. Jessica, take it away.
Great, thanks so much. Before I dive into the real content of the webinar, as an independent research firm, I just have to provide you with our disclaimer that we do not endorse any vendor, product, or service that we'll cover. And we disclaim all warranties with respect to anything that we present here today. So with that, I'd like to just jump right into the agenda, which Lalit went over, and start with the regulatory sustainability landscape. So anyone who works even remotely in the sustainability field, I'm sure has heard a lot of the buzz, both in the US and the EU, all around the world about climate, sustainability related regulations. And what we find at Verdantix, and we've seen this trend over the last 10 years or so, is that regulations in terms of sustainability tend to originate mostly in Europe and then move elsewhere. Europe tends to be a little bit farther ahead. And this is certainly the case nowadays. And I just wanted to highlight some of the key regulations that we either see currently in place in Europe or that we see coming live within the next few years. And the first, as mentioned earlier, is the CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And the CSRD is looking to replace an existing regulation known as the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, or NFRD, which is currently in place, has been in place for several years, and applies to large publicly listed European firms, so about 11,000, 12,000 firms or so. And the CSRD was implemented, or will be implemented, to address existing concerns over the NFRD. So primarily about the scope and the comparability of the NFRD to other regulations. So it's eventually going to impact close to 50,000 firms just within Europe, and we'll dive into this a little bit more, what that means and everything. Another regulation that we see coming into place soon within the European Union is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. And this regulation is still being finalized. We're expecting it in early 2024, or we're expecting it to be finalized in early 2024. So implementation, a year plus after that. But this will apply to both EU and non-EU firms, and it's going to require them to evaluate various human rights, social and environmental conditions within their supply chain. So pretty large rippling effects expected with that regulation. And then there's a couple more general sustainability regulations that are already in place in the EU. And the first is this EU taxonomy, which at its core is a classification system for economic activities. And it was really created to help investors make smart decisions about how to invest in sustainable assets. And the other regulation that relates quite closely to the EU taxonomy is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or the SFDR. And that requires financial market participants, so think, large banks, asset managers, to prepare and disclose on certain sustainability related information. But if we move beyond the EU, we see that there have been several especially climate-focused disclosures that have been required in the US and throughout the world, really. So within the US, the two that are probably most discussed are the SEC's proposed climate disclosure rule and the California's climate disclosure laws, which were just passed a couple months ago. The SEC's proposed climate disclosure rules, well, both the SEC and the California legislation would require firms to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions as well as certain climate-related risks. The SEC, we're still waiting to see when they'll finalize their rule. We thought it would be this year, but right now it's looking like early 2024. But the California legislation will apply to any business, public or privately listed, that does business in California and meets certain revenue thresholds. So that's expected to take place or require reporting starting in 2026. And then looking at a more global scale, we're seeing several countries that are implementing climate-based disclosures that follow the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And those similarly require firms to disclose a whole variety of metrics, policies, and procedures, all relating to climate. So greenhouse gas emissions, scenario plans, things of that nature. And that applies to countries like Europe, to countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Brazil, Singapore, Japan, just to name a few. And the list there really seems to keep growing. And lastly is this the concept of the TNFD, or the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And these are all currently voluntary, but we expect this to follow a similar path to the TCFD-based disclosures. We'll start seeing certain countries start to require specific regulations within their jurisdictions based on the TNFD. That I'd like to dive into the CSRD in a bit more detail. And even though I say a bit more detail, because of the complexity of the regulation, I'm really only going to be scratching the surface here. It's a very complex regulation. So I'll provide an overview and provide some of the key challenges that we're seeing. But I just want to reiterate that it's a very nuanced regulation. So when looking at whether or not it applies to me, when it applies to me, that sort of thing. That's really an evaluation that you'll need to do with your legal team, and it'll require more time than we can devote in a 1-hour webinar. But overall, the CSRD really aims to strengthen the quality of sustainability reporting within the EU. So it's going to require firms to disclose investor grade data so that it's widely accessible to a variety of stakeholders. And this includes investors. And the CSRD, as I mentioned, was developed partly to help investors make sustainability or to use sustainability information to improve their investment decisions. And it really goes a step beyond the NFRD. And I think one of the biggest step changes there is this emphasis that the CSRD places on investor grade, really high quality data. So holding sustainability data to the same standards that most regulators hold financial data subject to. And one of the other goals of the CSRD is really to increase access to the sustainability related information and also comparability of this information, both between different firms and within some of the different frameworks and standards that I've mentioned. And in terms of who will be subject to the CSRD, there's several different categories of firms, and I'll discuss in a bit sort of the phase and approach that the CSRD is taking in terms of when different categories of firms have to apply. But generally, it's going to apply to all large firms in the EU that meet certain criteria related to their number of employees, their annual revenue, their total assets. But it's also going to apply to small and medium-sized enterprises within the EU that are listed on regulated markets, as well as certain non-EU firms that have some sort of presence in the EU and that meet certain turnover thresholds. So I think the key takeaways there is that it's going to apply to a large range of companies, both in the EU and outside of the EU. And it's not just some of the larger firms that we're used to seeing subject to these reporting requirements. Okay. So some of the big takeaways from that are about 11,700 firms are currently subject to reporting under the NFRD. But what we're expecting in terms of the CSRD is that 50,000 or so firms just within Europe are going to be required to report by 2027. So that's quite a big jump, more than tripling the number of firms that are going to be subject. And this doesn't even account for firms outside of the EU. So as you'll see, the CSRD, one of the reasons that we're devoting so much time to it today is that it's going to be impacting so many firms directly and have ripple effects throughout the economy.
Quick question there, Jessica.
Sure.
So do you have any metric on what that number would be for non-EU firms that may be like global firms that have they do business in multinational firms that do business in Europe? Do you have any kind of metric on what that number might be?
Yeah, so there was a study put out by the data firm Refinitiv earlier this year, and their estimate is that about 10,000 firms outside of the EU will be subject to the CSRD. The phase and timeline for non-European based firms is a little later, which I'll get into. I think it's the next slide. There we go. But I do know about 3,000 of those firms will be in the US alone, but it will be so that accounts for about 7,000 firms beyond the EU and the US. So really wide reaching.
Gotcha.
And that's actually a great segue into this next slide, which shows the phase-in approach that the European Commission is taking when implementing the CSRD. So when I say the CSRD comes into effect next year, that is certainly true, but it's only coming into effect for those firms that are currently subject to the NFRD reporting requirements. And those 11,700 or so firms are going to have to report in 2025 for the sustainability data that they collect in the year 2024. And then there's a phase-in approach. So large undertakings within Europe that are not subject to the NFRD will have to report 1 year later than that. Small and medium-sized firms are going to have within Europe, I should say, are going to have to report 1 year after that. And then 2 years later, so reporting in 2029 for financial year 2028, that's going to be when those 10,000 or so firms outside of the EU are going to have to report in line with the CSRD. So the phase-in approach hopefully, gives some companies time to prepare and get everything up in working order before they're actually required to do reporting. Okay. But we've talked about, the scope of, or how broad and wide-reaching the CSRD is. But what really makes the CSRD so challenging are some of the key components. And these are some of those components that really differentiate it from the NFRD and from a lot of the other regulations that we're seeing out there. So I'll talk about each of these 5 elements in a little bit more detail, but just, a high-level overview. The ESRS framework, or the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, is going to require firms to report across a variety of environmental, social, and governance topics. And when we think about some of the other climate-related disclosures that we're seeing, the SEC, California, TCFD-based reporting, those are really focused on just certain elements of that environmental portion of the ESRS. So climate-related risk, greenhouse gas emissions. So the ESRS framework is more overarching. Another is this concept of double materiality, which is really requiring firms to take both an inside-out and outside-in look at how different factors impact their company. This third element, the CSRD is going to require firms to obtain third-party assurance of their sustainability data, starting with limited assurance and then moving to reasonable assurance a few years after that. Another key challenge of the CSRD is that it's going to require reporting from across the value chain. So reporting not just on your firm's sustainability data, but also looking at your upstream suppliers and your downstream end users and some of their sustainability metrics. And then another key element is that the CSRD is going to require companies to report on both forward-looking and retrospective elements. So a lot of the regulations that we see require that retrospective reporting. So reporting on what your emissions, for example, were over the past year. But this forward-looking, so, how are you going to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions in the next 5 years, 20 years? Those are elements of the CSRD. And overcoming some of these, oh, go ahead.
I just thought occurred to me, it's not really a
Yeah.
question, but the reporting across entire value chain. So we talked about 11,000 firms that are currently required to report to NFRD and growing to 50,000 plus. But if you look at the reporting across entire value chain, if you are one of those firms in Europe that are exempt from that requirement because you're much smaller, the challenge for you will be that the firms that you do business with that do have CSRD requirement, they will be putting pressure on you to provide them the emissions data so they can report it to the CSRD. So the impact is actually even bigger than the 50,000 firms that we just talked about, just looking at this element of the CSRD.
Yeah, completely agree. It's that ripple effect. And it's not just, smaller firms within Europe. It's going to impact, firms outside of Europe, even if they're required to report in 2029 for 2028, they might have to provide emissions data to their suppliers, their customers, whoever it may be, sooner than that. Right. So really good point.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
But diving in a little bit more to the ESRS framework. So this is something that is established by the CSRD and really serves as the foundation for sustainability reporting under the requirement. So it establishes a common set of guidelines for firms to follow when disclosing their ESG performance. And as you'll see here, there are 10 different topical standards that firms need to report on, ranging from things like climate change and pollution to their workforce and then business conduct. But there's also 2 cross-cutting standards, which are more general and don't necessarily fall into one of those 3 pillars. And this is the set of ESRSs that are currently that have currently been passed, but there's a second set that's currently in development, which focuses more on sector-specific standards, as well as simplified standards for some of those smaller and medium-sized enterprises that I mentioned. But those are really still under development with the European Commission. I think what we see on the screen here is what most firms can expect to report to. And in total, under this ESRS framework, there's over 1,000 data points that firms may need to report to under the CSRD. And not all of these points are going to be mandatory for every firm, but a lot of them will be. And what firms are going to have to report against is based on this concept of double materiality. So if you can go, yep, there we go. So double materiality.
Go back.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yep, okay. So double materiality, if you're not familiar with the term, it's really something that's relatively unique to the CSRD, and it looks at both impact materiality, which is how a business impacts its surrounding community. So think about things like, how your wastewater discharge impact the surrounding town, or how your volunteerism affects, your relationship with your community. And this is more of an inside-out viewpoint. But there's also financial materiality, which is how external factors, think of like floods or supply chain disruptions, impact your business. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the more voluntary reporting frameworks, the GRI is based on impact materiality, and SASB is based on financial impact materiality. If that helps frame, what do the different, types of frameworks look like there. But double materiality means firms are going to have to look at both impact and financial materiality, and they're going to have to report to the CSRD on all topics that are material from either a financial or an impact assessment point of view. Next slide. And disclosures across all of those topics are going to have to be investor grade to meet the upcoming assurance requirements of the CSRD. And when I say investor grade, that means that they're going to have to maintain the same quality as financial data. And so at Verdantix, we define this as data that is accurate. So there's some sort of documented approval process. It's auditable, so there's a paper trail for traceability and transparency. It's time relevant, so it's not just reporting that's done once a year. And it's automated, so it uses minimal manual data collection to avoid human error and mistakes. And having this investor grade data is applicable to numerous regulations that I mentioned earlier, not just the CSRD. And we're seeing it really as a best practice and a major step forward for most firms. And then just wanted to share one data point I have about that value chain requirement that we touched on earlier. And as part of our climate risk and net zero corporate survey, Verdantix interviewed 350 heads of net zero and asked them when they think their supply chain emissions, so their scope 3 emissions, will meet that investor grade standard, that financial audit requirement. And within the respondents in the EU, only 20% of them said they think that this will be done by 2024. Over half of respondents said they won't meet those requirements until 2029, which may pose some real concerns for them reporting in line with the CSRD.
So Jessica here, then those that are not going to be able to do that, or those who are not even sure how to get this started, what can they do to get prepared for this regulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot. I think one of the first steps that firms can take is really developing an internal team. The CSRD, as I mentioned, requires so much data from so many different departments. And so getting that internal team together to really evaluate what your needs are, what your current data collection processes look like. I think that's step one. Another crucial step is typically looking for software to help comply with the investor grade requirements of the CSRD. when we speak with corporates and, in our experience, it's really hard to manage a lot of the data that's required with just, spreadsheets alone. And if you are going to implement software, you first need to figure out, what your needs are, and then look for a software solution to help you. And, this is not an overnight fix. It's a process that takes several months, the software evaluation process, implementation. So I think for firms that want to start getting prepared, it's I think those are the first two sort of introductory steps. But first start with, assembling your internal team, look at what your internal resources are, and then look to see what sorts of digital solutions can help.
Right, that's perfect.
And that actually transitions well into some of the insights that we're seeing I want to share more of our global corporate survey results to show sort of some of the trends that we're seeing within the market. So if you can go to the next slide. So as part of we ran this summer a global corporate survey where we interviewed 400 heads of sustainability from a variety of industries. And one of the questions we asked them is how much they're seeing or how much they're prioritizing funding for certain sustainability improvements over the next 2 years. So pretty short term. And what we saw is that 73% of respondents see mandatory disclosure reporting as either a top priority or a high priority item. So, I mean, that's a fairly significant piece of the pie right there. And it's really showing shifting customer needs and funding priorities to, assist with those disclosure reporting elements. And, our belief is that the CSRD is most likely driving a lot of those responses. So next slide. Great. And part of the reason for this increase in spend, this increase in interest around regulatory disclosures is because the regulations will have those direct and indirect impacts on pretty much, a wide variety of firms. And Lalit, to your point earlier, you asked, well, if I'm not subject, what's going to happen? And I think those are sort of the direct and indirect impacts that we're seeing in the market. So when I say direct impacts, I'm talking about firms that are or will be subject to the CSRD, whereas indirect impacts are what's going to apply to firms who are not subject to the CSRD, because they're still going to see and feel the impacts of those regulations because of those scope 3, those value chain requirements. So if we're looking, we've talked a lot about the direct impacts, having to prepare disclosures, having to obtain assurance, things like that. But I think the indirect impacts we haven't touched quite as much on. And I think what we're going to see is that firms that are not directly impacted are really going to start seeing more pressure from suppliers and from customers who are subject to the CSRD, and they're going to need to prepare disclosures for their value chain. So everyone's going to be sort of putting pressure on firms to get that data ready to disclose. So I think those are some of the ripple effects that you mentioned earlier.
If you don't mind, there is actually
Sure.
a very pertinent question that an attendee posted. So what happens to organizations that are required to submit data but who do not comply and do not comply at least in a timely manner? What kind of teeth does the regulation have to mitigate that?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So enforcement of the CSRD is going to be left to the individual member states. So there's not one universal answer there, and I believe most of the member states are still developing what the penalties will be for noncompliance. It will typically be fines, potentially sanctions, but I'd really have to defer to whatever member state the question is coming from. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, the data that we're seeing that's required for the CSRD is really coming from a large variety of sources. So if I go back to that survey that I mentioned earlier, we asked the respondents, the sustainability heads, for each of the following business functions, how they see each one being involved in their firm's ESG and sustainability strategy. And what we're seeing is that there were a large amount of respondents who indicated that really, all of these functions are responsible for helping define the strategy, helping influence the strategy, or providing data to enforce the strategy. And so we're seeing a wide range of departments: risk, compliance, and audit. I think that really ties into the assurance requirements of the CSRD, but also department functions ranging from environmental health and safety to IT to supply chain, human resources. So really getting the data that you need for the CSRD is really more of a team sport. And there's a really big challenge here about how to gather that data, how to make sure it's, investor grade across all departments. It's definitely a big challenge that we're seeing here. If you move to the next slide, we also found from our survey that there's still a really heavy reliance in the market on spreadsheets to manage sustainability data. And using spreadsheets, and this is what I meant earlier when most corporates are going to have to turn to software to help them. Because in our experience and talking with corporates, talking with regulators, software is just not sufficient for handling such large amounts of data that need to be, in that investor grade level. Spreadsheets aren't automated. There's no audit trail. There's a high likelihood for human error just because of the nature of the beast. And using spreadsheets is especially difficult for firms with more complex value chains. So oil and gas, metals and mining, financial services even. But in our global corporate survey, we found that only 29% of vendors are using software to manage their ESG and sustainability data. So a lot lower than we expected. We think a lot of firms still relying on spreadsheets or on software that they develop in-house, which in our experience is typically spreadsheets. It's some sort of, BI functionality or something like that. And when thinking about software, we also asked another question specifically about how respondents view certain digital capabilities in the short term. And I know our focus today has been on regulatory disclosures, but I just wanted to share an interesting statistic here that 75% of respondents are still thinking of voluntary reporting. So reporting for your annual sustainability report or in line with SASB, CDP, they're still thinking of that as either a very high or a high priority item. But just under that, almost 2/3 of respondents saw facility level emissions, so scope 1, scope 2 emissions. They found data acquisition tools to help with those as either a high or very high priority item. And that's followed by scope 3 emissions. So only about 1/3 are seeing scope 3 emissions as a top or very high priority. And this, I guess, isn't all that surprising because firms can't really get a handle on their scope 3 emissions, which are their value chain emissions, until they really understand more of their internal emissions. So the scope 1, scope 2. But just wanted to share this, sort of where the market sits in terms of their thoughts and priorities when thinking about carbon accounting and net zero capabilities. So just to wrap up before I hand it back to you, Lalit, a few key takeaways that we're seeing here, and just to reiterate that the CSRD will start taking effect in just a few weeks for some firms and will directly impact over 50,000 firms just in Europe, with another 10,000 or so firms throughout the world. And it's going to have countless ripple effects. So those indirect impacts that we mentioned earlier. Another key takeaway is that firms are going to need to prepare investor grade data to meet the upcoming regulations. So that investor grade data, that's the data that, is really held to the same level of care as financial data. So it has to be auditable, accurate, timely. It's a big step, a big change to more operational data that most firms are used to when they think about their sustainability data. And then the last item I'd like to reiterate is that in our view, in the Verdantix view, data acquisition and management tools are really essential to ensuring compliance. So making sure that you had that audit trail, making sure that you had those data quality checks. Those are really key to ensuring compliance with not just the CSRD, but all those other regulations that I touched upon earlier. So with that, Lalit, I'll hand it back over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a really good summary slide because it's almost like when you're thinking of taking on a home improvement project, you first make sure that you have the right tools. So your point to making sure that you have the right tools to be able to comply with this, whether it's a voluntary, whether it's a regulatory requirement, it's absolutely necessary. And the old adage of you can't manage what you don't measure. So having this data and the tools in your tool belt to go tackle such a complex challenge is definitely a necessity. So thank you so much, Jessica, for a high-level overview of the regulatory landscape, specifically with CSRD and sharing some of your Verdantix data with our listeners today. So with that, I'll take a few minutes here and jump into a specific software solution, a software solution that my company, EnergyCAP, has developed for helping tackle some of these issues for the sustainability leaders and the leaders across the globe, actually. So we coined the term energy and sustainability ERP because if you think about how the accounting systems went from paper-based, ledger-based to spreadsheets, and now we have those ERP systems for financial data, that's where we think the world is moving when it comes to energy and sustainability data also. So back in the day, we were barely even measuring our energy consumption or our supply chain consumption, where then we are currently probably majority of us, as Jessica's data showed, we are still relying on spreadsheets to do a lot of this data collection and reporting out of. But with with that, you have the challenge of not having that auditability and that single source of truth that you may need to be able to use all those different areas to collect all your data. So we have a suite of products that we allow you to use for doing a lot of work that you need to do. Jessica pointed out earlier that scope 1 and 2 sometimes is a challenge for a lot of companies because they haven't done a good job of collecting that data. So we have tools like our utility management, portfolio level energy and sustainability reporting software solution, Carbon Hub, which is the financial grade greenhouse gas accounting solution. And if you really want to get a deep dive into figuring out where your data is showing some outliers or how the impacts could be, we also have smart analytics platform that combine these solutions, really form that energy and sustainability ERP that will allow you to not just measure what you're doing, but also to report with confidence that the data that you have is complying with the regulatory requirements, and it doesn't matter which regulatory requirement that you're trying to satisfy. Jessica also pointed out earlier that there is definitely a need for automation. So we provide some capture services that automate your utility bills, so you don't have to worry about manually punching it in to reduce your data entry manual errors. And Jessica also shared this, it's a team sport anymore. So energy and sustainability data doesn't just come from one source. You get it from your utility consumption, you get it from your facilities operation. If you have a fleet or your employee commute, you have transportation metrics that you're getting, and so on and so forth. So there's so many other sources of data that if you start doing all this data collation in spreadsheets, you're probably going to soon find yourself very limited in the functionality. And oh, by the way, spreadsheets don't naturally have the ability to do any audit trails of who changed what when. And an energy and sustainability ERP solution, which becomes that single source of truth, no matter where the data is coming from, it allows you to put it all in one system. So now you can do some kind of tracking and reporting across your organization. So that's the big idea, and that's what our company, we are a software company, so that's what we do. I just want to share a few screenshots really quickly and just share with you what some of the capabilities are in our software platform. So Jessica again mentioned that scope one, the direct data that the direct consumption that you have of greenhouse gases, we allow you to bring in any of your consumption into the platform so you can easily convert that into greenhouse gas inventory. And we use industry standard factors that take any, in this particular screen that you're seeing, natural gas can be converted easily into carbon dioxide equivalent. If you're tracking your electricity consumption, then you can do location-based tracking. So our software allows you to map your uh, particular electricity consumption to a factor that is either regional in nature or it can also be global. So we have factors all across the world that you can say a kilowatt hour, how much does that equal to a carbon footprint? Because not every kilowatt hour is produced with the same level of green energy. So some places may be a little more green, more progressive, where some places, either because of lack of infrastructure or because of the choice, they may not be as green. But this allows you to measure what that carbon impact is of the electricity that you're using. If you do engage with the market where you're trying to get some renewable energy credits, or if you're looking at carbon offsets, the platform also allows you to bring in those so you can document them. And these offsets and RECs will basically reduce your carbon impact from those location-based scope 1 and 2 data points. And so here is an example of how you can even create location-based versus market-based reporting on your carbon footprint for your scope 1 and scope 2. And then when it comes to scope 3, this is where things get even more fun. So what we do is within Carbon Hub, we allow you to use any kind of consumption. So whether it's volume-based, weight-based, distance-based, and even for that matter, if you're not tracking any of those metrics, you can also use currency-based tracking, because ultimately you know what you paid for in terms of whatever commodity that you're using. While it may not be 100% accurate, it's still auditable and trackable. So if you don't have more accurate data, you can still use dollar-based or whatever currency that you're using, currency-based tracking for your greenhouse gas information. And as you mature as an organization, as your team matures as an organization, you can start moving towards more accurate measurement as time progresses. So what we can do for you in Carbon Hub, what you can do using Carbon Hub is you can track purchase utilities at the level of detail you have. So for example, if you track individual utility bills when you have that available, great. We can bring those in on a monthly, quarterly, or annual level, depending on how your suppliers are providing you that data. And all you have to do is record the date range and quantity. EnergyCAP will manage a bunch of factors for you. As the factors change, we will make sure that we record those in a time-effective manner. So Carbon Hub includes many built-in factors. So those that are published by EPA, IPCC, or any regulatory agencies that provide factors for raw fuels, we bring those in and we record them and make them time effective, so data effective. So you don't have to worry about them. You just say, hey, I burned 50 tons of natural gas, and it automatically converts to greenhouse gases. If you have electricity, we have data from eGrid from EPA, and we bring that again on an annual basis. And we also subscribe to IEA, International Global Electricity Factor. So we do that also on a time-effective, data-effective basis. So all you have to do is tie it to your country-specific or a region-specific area, and going forward, we'll manage that for you. In addition to that, we are bringing factors from EPA, DEFRA, and other published Scope 3 and life cycle assessment agencies, so we will manage those for you also. But you may say, well, that's all fine, but I have more specific information. I may have factors that are being provided by my suppliers or vendors, like a PPA agreement for power purchase. Or you may have a very unique case where you have a specific fuel mix that you are using within your organization, or you're getting those custom factors from your supply chain. Well, Carbon Hub enables you to manage those custom factors using our platform. So it's not sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere else. It's all documented within the platform itself. So it allows you to have a little bit of automation, the easy button, so to speak, when your system and your situation is more generic. But if you have a more custom such situation, you can configure those factors yourself and manage that information. And what does that give you? What it gives you is an integrated report and dashboard for all your emissions. So you are able to easily group, filter, slice and dice the data with offsets, without offsets, to actually get a very high level bird's eye view of your carbon footprint. But then you also, because you're using a sustainable energy and sustainability ERP system, you also have the ability to slice and dice the data the way you want it, whether you're reporting it for a certain regulation that you're required to, or your supply chain is requiring you to present them the data in a different format. Carbon Hub is very agnostic to what kind of reporting that you are required to do. The data is all here. You can slice and dice it the way you want it. So that's some advantages of having a platform like EnergyCAP that allows you to manage your data. And as you are a multinational firm, you're probably going to be impacted by more than one regulation. So that's the other advantage, where you will be able to slice and dice it and do whatever reporting you want out of it. So just wanted to give you a high level overview of what our platform is capable of doing. Happy to engage with you more, and you can reach out to us and we'll be happy to discuss that further. That kind of brings us towards the end of the prepared content that we have, and we have about 11 minutes as I see here. So we'll jump straight into question and answers, Jessica, and I'm going to really rely on you because you are the subject matter expert here and you have a lot of team members that you work with on a regular basis, especially when it comes to this European regulation. So one of the first questions that we have is, how does the ISSB relate to these regulations?
That's a great question. So the ISSB is currently a voluntary framework, whereas a lot of these regulations that we talked about are not voluntary, they're mandatory. But they are striving to have some interoperability between the ISSB and the CSRD, as well as these other European regulations. Part of the goal of the ISSB, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is to reduce the amount of data requests to sort of increase the way that different disclosure regulations speak to one another, so to say. So I think there is quite a bit of overlap. One of the key differences is the ISSB is not based on double materiality, it's based on financial materiality, whereas the CSRD, as I mentioned, that's a key element of the regulation, is that concept of double materiality. So I think that's one big divergence there, but they are sort of trending in a similar direction.
Gotcha. Thank you. There was one question that probably I can take. It was specifically to the software. So what kind of data does the software need to calculate the GHG emission? So as I shared earlier, you can bring in your consumption data. So whether it's by volume, weight, energy content, and then if it is applicable with a standard GHG factor that's available within the platform, all you have to do is map those two, and you automatically get your carbon footprint for that particular consumption. As you keep changing how you're collecting the data, you may have to remap those. But if you are going to continue to bring in the data the way you want, you don't have to touch it. All you have to do is bring in the consumption data for whatever time period that you're bringing it. So really your consumption and your start and end date, so to speak. And that basically creates the platform for you. If you do have custom specific situations, then you will have to manage the factor also based on the information that your suppliers are providing for you. So hopefully that answered that question. Let me look through the questions here. One of the questions was, will companies that have subsidiaries outside the EU have to report their initiatives in these countries within the CSRD framework?
So I'll attempt to take that one. I'm not quite sure,
Okay.
to be perfectly honest. It's a complicated matter. I I mentioned earlier on that there are a lot of nuances to the CSRD, and I think this right here is a question that presents one of them. So I don't have a straight answer for you. I think it would really depend on your situation. And I don't, it would likely depend on, what country you're operating in, the size of your operations in that country. So definitely something that should be taken up with either a legal team, a consultant. Um, I don't think there's a one size fits all answer there.
Thank you, Jessica. One more for you, actually. So this is more about the verification. So you talked about how the data has to be validated.
Hmm.
So are the verification systems within or outside of the CSRD that ensure that the companies are accurately accounting for their emissions?
So I think I mentioned this earlier, but enforcement and verification of the CSRD is going to be left to each individual member state. As of now, I'm not aware of any universal type verification systems. Um, but I think, to evaluate whether or not firms are in compliance, each member state is going to develop their own sort of strategy, their own plans going forward, just as they have for other, key environmental or sustainability regulations. But there's not a universal process that I'm aware of right now.
Another question that I'll probably take a stab at first, and then I'll let you enhance that answer, is setting a short-term GHG reduction target a mandatory requirement per CSRD? My answer to that would be absolutely, it's a good idea to do that. It will eventually help you in your progress, but is that a requirement for CSRD, Jessica?
I believe it is. I believe there is a requirement to establish a reduction target for 2030. Um, uh, it's 2030, and then if possible 2050 as well. So 2030, I believe, would represent that short-term reduction target that was asked about.
Gotcha. This one is definitely for you. If you had to choose which framework or standard to start with, which one would I choose? Should I choose TCFD or CSRD?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. I hate to go back to it depends, but I think in this case, again, it really does. Um, it, I think if you're going to be subject to CSRD in the next year or two, it will take you that long to start preparing for those disclosures. Um, but if you're not going to be subject for another 3-4 years and you want to get something, um, publicly facing out before then I think it would be a good idea to start with another framework. So TCFD, um, unless you're in one of those countries that I mentioned earlier, and there's quite a list of them: Singapore, Japan, Brazil, UK. Um, the TCFD is a voluntary framework, so those countries that I mentioned have established mandatory regulations around the framework, based on the framework. But the framework itself, if you're outside of those operating jurisdictions, is voluntary. So that can be something that's incorporated into an annual sustainability report, for instance. So I think it would really depend on when you'd be required to report in line with the CSRD, if you'd be required to report in line with it. Um, and then also if you've ever done any sort of sustainability reporting before, what sort of data you've collected, what processes you have in place for that. But again, I would say there's no one size fits all answer for that one either.
Okay, that's fair. One question for the software platform, I can take this one, is does the platform provide a section for double materiality assessment? We do not today, but that is something that's on our roadmap, so we will be developing that as time goes on. There is a two-part question. is there a lot of crossover with the CSRD and SFDR? And does CDP and EcoVadis support the CSRD?
Oh, that's a loaded question. So in terms of crossover between CSRD and SFDR, I would say yes, there is a good amount of crossover in terms of the requirements themselves. The CSRD, I do believe, has more requirements. As I mentioned, with the establishment of the ESRS, there are over 1,000 data points under the CSRD. I think the key difference here is just the number of firms who are subject to the different regulations. So just a refresher for those the SFDR is only applicable to financial market participants within Europe. So it's a much smaller subset of European firms, whereas the CSRD has much wider, a wider breadth of scale there. So I'd say a lot of the key requirements are similar, and I'd have to double check. I cannot actually recall if SFDR is based on double materiality or not. I don't think it is, but I would need to double check that. So that requirement could be different as well. But the requirements to have that investor grade data, to have data across, a variety of different, topics, that there is overlap in that respect. And sorry, what was the second part of the question? I thought you mentioned CDP.
Yes. So does the CDP and EcoVadis support the CSRD?
I believe they do, but again, I'd have to look into what, how strongly they support it.
Right.
EcoVadis, certainly does. CDP, there is overlap between CDP and there's some of the requirements of the CSRD, but I don't know directly how strongly that support is.
Gotcha. That's great. I think we'll take one last question. I think you mentioned something about cross-cutting general disclosures. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. So yeah, if you remember earlier, I had that slide showing the different aspects of the ESRS. So there's, environmental aspects, which includes things like, pollution and climate change, business conduct. And these are pretty similar to what we see in a lot of, if we think about, more traditional ESG. But these cross-cutting standards, and there's two of them, and they don't really fit into any of these buckets. They're really talking more about the overall processes that firms use for disclosure of information. So there might not be any specific content that needs to be reported, but it's looking for more about the processes, how materiality assessments are conducted, different disclosure topics that apply to these general standards. So sort of similar to the TCFD, where they ask about, disclosures towards governance strategy, risks. So requiring more about the processes in place regarding those metrics and how you would report on them.
Perfect. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. Thank you very much for all the questions that everybody submitted, and thank you for your attention. And thank you so much, Jessica, for all the information that you shared with our attendees today. I mean, it's an alphabet soup of regulation that's out there. And it's amazing that you and Verdantix team is able to make it so much more simpler to understand than just going and reading the regulation itself. So thank you very much. And as a reminder, the recording will be available for this webinar within 1 or 2 days. And good luck with all the regulations that are coming down the pike. So give us a call or contact us if you are interested in the software. Thanks, Jessica.
Great. Thank you very much.